changes in real time. So it's a lot of fun. It's if you're a programmer to mess around with. That's why it's called Playground. It's nothing, you're not doing anything real serious, but it's a good way to get familiar with the APIs and see what effects different changes have. But let me go ahead and show some demos of some of these so that you can see what they really do. So one of the first things you'll notice about this is when I change slides on this slide presentation, this connection is pretty slow, but it's working. Going back to DNS, resolving host, connecting. This is great. It's like the old days. This is like 28.8 modems, the 300 baud even, you know, where you could watch everything happen in real time. A lot of fun. Natsukashi is what we'd say in Japanese about that. Okay, let me show you something. You can't really see it, and I can't make the address bar bigger, but if you look at the top of the address bar here, I get my little laser thing so I can point you where I'm talking about. If you look at the top of the address bar, what you'll see here is there's a fragment ID on the end of this URL. So what you have is a URL, which is for a site, and then you have a single page, and what you have is the hash sign, the sharp, and then, you know, a slide number. And what this means is, if you look at this entire presentation is one single web page. It's divided up into logical pages, but it's physically it's one single document. And what you'll see happens is if I go forward in this slide, you'll see that the hash just changed. So it's now number 2. That says slide 2. And what's really cool about this is if I hit the back button on my browser, instead of going back to whatever previous URL I was at, which is probably like a porn site or something, I don't know, I don't want to go back to that one. But so that's the danger of doing presentations too. You know, you hit the back button, you go back to something you don't want people to see. So don't do that either. That's the other lesson for today. If I hit the back button, it takes me back to, well, it should. God damn it. I'm cursed. I've done something wrong here, and God is punishing me, so. Well, what you should see happen when you push the back button is it takes you back to the previous fragment ID instead of taking you back to the previous URL. And that's part of HTML5, which is something that's called, there's a hash change event, and there's a handler for that that's called onHashChange. And when the hash changes, then, you know, you can associate some action with it. And what's really cool about this is you can write an AJAX application, an XHR application that uses AJAX communication asynchronously with the web server, and like your email application, like you can do with Gmail. And when the state of that application changes, you can associate that. You can basically tag that or peg it, whatever you want to call it, and you can go back to that state. So when you're pushing the back button, you're not going back to a previous URL. You're going back to a previous state of the application. And that's a really, really powerful thing. It's not so cool when you see it demoed, but as a programmer, that's what you really want. You want, when users push the back button, you don't want them to go back to the previous URL. You want them to stay in your application and go back to the previous state. So that's what happens with this. All right, let me get to some of the coolest part of this. So I'm going to just tear through most of this, and I'll come back. There's about 50 slides in this thing. And I really, really highly recommend that if you're interested in the programmatic part of HTML5, that you go and look at this, mess around with it, check out some of the videos, check out some of the demos, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But first thing I really want to show is an example of programming in CSS. Now, most people don't think of CSS as a programming language, but it is. It is a programming language. It just uses a declarative syntax. Instead of using an imperative syntax like JavaScript does, JavaScript's an imperative language. CSS is a declarative language. So you declare things and they happen. And what we can see here first is the normal way that you do something with CSS and JavaScript is if you have this red box here on the right side of the page and you want to move it to the left side of the page and you want to move it to the right side of the page, this is not a terrifically exciting programming challenge. But the way that you would do this today in most browsers, this is the effect you would get. Oh, shit. Oh, there we go. See, I don't know the difference between left and right, and I've just demonstrated that also. So I was pushing the left button. It was already at the left. So this is called pilot error. This is the cause of airplane crashes. You know, the pilot keeps pressing, he thinks he's going right, but he keeps pressing left, you know. Anyway, so you go left, you go right. You notice that there's no transition behavior there. This sucks, actually, as a user interface programming feature. You don't want things going like jerking back and forth like this. What you want is a smooth transition. And there are ways to do this with JavaScript. You set timers, you do other things, you have something move across the page in a smooth way. Well, you can now do this in CSS. And let me expand the CSS just to show you what it looks like, because it's really dead simple. If I can move around here, that's a little too much maybe. The important part to demonstrate here is just this part, if I can get my Mac OS stuff out of the way. It's just this part here, WebKit transition. Margin left, this doesn't say LS, it says 1 second, and it says ease in, out. That's the whole programming that's going on here. There's a little bit of JavaScript that just binds the transition to an event, and the event is me pushing one of these buttons. But the actual work is being done using CSS. And so let me put this back down and show you what happens. If I say left, nothing's going to happen again. But if I say right, you see there's a smooth transition there. And this is not being done through any form of JavaScript. This is all being handled by the CSS engine in the browser and through this transition command. So this is simple programming. This is probably just about the simplest kind of programming you can do in a browser as far as programming using CSS. And so CSS has gotten some new features for animations, for transitions, for transformations. And this is some of the coolest stuff because it's some of the easiest stuff to program. So even if you're more of a designer than a web developer, you're more of a HTML author than you are a JavaScript programmer, this is something that you can get started with. And this works today in Chrome. I'm demoing this in Chrome, and it works in WebKit. I'm not sure the versions because I run all the development versions of browsers. So I run WebKit nightlies, I run Chrome dev channel releases, I run Minefield. So I don't know when this stuff actually makes it into actual releases, but it'll be there soon if it's not in there already. So let me go back and show you some other things from the beginning of the presentation. Maybe my back button will work now. There we go. No, I'm hitting the back button and it's going up. So I am just out of favor with the gods today. So let me go back to the beginning and I'll start the slides from the beginning. I have about 7 minutes here, so I'll go over some of the really, really important stuff for you to know about. I mentioned in the beginning, very little of what we're doing in HTML5 is really all that new. What we're doing is importing, in large part, what we're doing is importing some features that are part of other programming languages, other application frameworks, other application platforms, and making them part of the web platform in a way that integrates with the programming model for the web. One of the coolest and most important ways that we're doing this is through this mechanism that's called web workers. And this came originally from Google Gears, which is gone now, but web workers now has a new life as part of the web platform. And what workers is, some people compare it to threads, but it's a way of taking a computationally expensive 10 minutes I have. I somehow got an extra bit of time there. So God is smiling upon me a little bit at least today. What web workers is, it's kind of like threads, like I said, but what you can do is, it's not threads because JavaScript doesn't have threads. And basically, I don't know how many people are threads programmers here, but you only want to program threads if you're like a masochist and you really want to cause yourself a lot of frustration. But we're not going to have threads in JavaScript. What we have instead is this mechanism that lets you take a process and background it. so that when you run that process, it doesn't block the UI. The most important thing in programming, one of the most important things at least, if not the most important, is that you do not want to have the UI blocked. You don't want to have the user taking some action, pressing a button, doing something, and seeing nothing happen, or seeing the UI lock up. It prevents them from doing something else. For example, you don't want a user, if they're uploading attachments to their web-based email client, you don't want those uploading of attachments to block their composition if they're composing a message. You want them to be able to compose a message and have all that stuff go on at the same time. That you don't really need workers for, but there's some other things where, especially when you get into graphics programming and some other things that are very computationally expensive, you want to background that process, and you want to have the main user interface react once that process is done. This is basically what workers is for. And it's using essentially message passing. So if you're used to programming in other languages where you're using a lot of message passing, that's really what this is. It's a message passing mechanism that lets you program using concurrent processes. It's not really concurrency like on the level of Erlang or something like that, but it's like that. That's the mental model to map it to. So it's really extremely important. And this is a really cool demo, because what this demo shows you, it does this computationally expensive multiple node mapping thing. And if you try to move the map around while it's doing that, you'll find that your movement of the map is blocked. So the UI has been blocked by that process of doing the computation. If you have that background process of doing the mapping, the node connections in the background, then you can still move the map around and everything works fine. And then when that process ends, you'll see that the map gets updated. So this is a really cool demo to look at and to look at the code for, because it'll teach you, show you how you can program applications in this way that don't block the UI. Another thing that we have is almost every other programming language that's a serious programming language has a method for creating sockets and for doing network communication using raw sockets, doing socket communications with arbitrary TCP/IP applications. Well, JavaScript doesn't have this. JavaScript does not natively have a socket interface. And this feature of HTML5, which is called WebSockets, is not actually a real TCP socket. But it's about as close, it is as close as you're ever going to get in JavaScript to having a raw TCP socket. And what this allows you to do is you can take a JavaScript application, a web application, and you can have it do real, full duplex, bidirectional communication over a socket with a server. And you can have multiple clients doing that, and then what you have is you can create something like a chat application where you have real-time XMPP communication going from one web application to another in real time, well, near real time. It's really important for applications like chat. What we do today is we have hacks that, the term that's used, the general term that's used for these hacks is Comet, but Comet is a hack. It's not a standard. It's never been standardized. It's some hacky ways to fake full duplex bidirectional communication. WebSockets is a real full duplex bidirectional communication mechanism. And the main use case for this is things like chat applications, but there are other applications too. Things like games, MUDs. Ian Hickson, who's the editor of the HTML5 spec, has actually written a MUD using WebSockets. Do people still know what MUD is? Gamers? MUD? Multi-user dimension. It's kind of like text-based gaming. Yeah, old school. Cool. Here's another thing that's cool, and I may actually be able to demo this, and it may work. We'll see. Okay, so I just said set notification permissions for this page, and it's asking me, I want to allow HTML5 rocks to show notifications, and I want to say allow, and I need to put my Twitter ID. I could actually put anybody's Twitter ID in here, but I'll put my own, and I'll say show tweet notifications, and we'll see if this actually works. It's probably not going to, as my luck is. Oh, holy Christ, there we go. Now, the important thing about this is that is not a notification that was generated by the web browser. That is a notification generated by the operating system.